Welcome again, everybody. My name is Paige Rivard. I'm the CEO of PWSA, and as I've said in the previous sessions, mom to Jake, who has PWS. Several of you, like I said, were with us for our other presentations, and welcome back to those of you who are with us, and welcome to those who are just joining us. A reminder that this summit is being recorded. It will be posted to our YouTube channel as well as housed on our website. And a link to all the presentations will also be sent out to everyone who registered once it's ready. So Kasey Bedard is with us today, and I'm excited to introduce you to Kasey. She'll be presenting on understanding tantrum behavior in PWS and why it happens, what to do about it. She is a wealth of information and expertise. Kasey is a board certified behavior analyst and international behavior analyst. She specializes in training the behavior problems associated with Prader-Willi syndrome, treating the behavior problems. Kasey focuses on providing early behavioral intervention for children with PWS to prevent and reduce behavior problems. She's a staunch advocate for the use of creative technologies, including telehealth, to reduce treatment barriers and expand access to specialists in PWS for families worldwide. Kasey's research focuses on the development of both PWS-specific early intervention and systemic treatment programs to help teenagers and adults with PWS succeed in educational and vocational settings. She believes that behavior analysis can help create a bright future for individuals with PWS and is passionate about finding ways to support the worldwide PWS community. Kasey, thank you again for sharing your time and expertise with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Of course. Thanks for the introduction, Paige, and it's my pleasure to be here with everybody today. So I've been working with people with PWS, oh my gosh, I think for 8, maybe 9 years now, and I work, like Paige said, both with children and adults in the research and in the clinical setting. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about tantrum behavior today. And we're going to start by talking about some of the recent research that's come out in relation to PWS and brain structure and function. So one of the main questions that I get a lot from parents is, why do tantrums happen so much for children with PWS? And part of the answer to that is, I think, being shown really nicely by, there's 2 recent articles that have come out. One is talking about brain structure and function in children. The other is talking about brain structure and function in adults with PWS. And so what these articles did is they took a group of people with PWS and they did some brain scans, and they compared those brain scans to people with people who had obesity but did not have PWS, and people who were without PWS and were of a normal weight. And they were essentially looking to see if there were any brain differences that could explain some of the challenges that people with PWS experience. And so what they found was that there are some significant differences in the size of some brain regions between people with PWS and people without PWS. And I think that this really nicely explains why people with PWS struggle with certain challenges. And so the first brain region that they were looking at was the amygdala, which is important for processing emotions and regulating emotional reactions. The second is the thalamus, which is important for processing sensory signals. The third is the hippocampus, which is important for critical memory. And then the hypothalamus, which is essentially regulating under any systems that are not under your conscious control. So any of those behaviors that you don't necessarily have to think about to engage in. So that's things like sleep, body temperature, and hunger and thirst. And all of these differences in brain structure and function can predispose specific behavior challenges. So for example, tantrum behavior can occur more often because people with PWS have a weaker portion of their brain that's responsible for emotional regulation. And you combine that with other challenges that people with PWS experience, like difficulties with communication, struggling with being tired all the time, and you could understand how this creates kind of a recipe for disaster when it comes to tantrum behavior. So we have some in addition to these differences in brain structure and function, there are other challenges that can be directly and indirectly related to tantrums. So obviously, emotional regulation is directly related to tantrums, but other things like rigidity and difficulty with transitions, impulsivity, and low muscle tone and tiredness can result in escalation to tantrums if people with PWS are not provided with the support they need to ensure that they're able to overcome these challenges. So I would just like you to try to conceptualize tantrums in a different way. So because your child has PWS, they're expected to succeed in society that oftentimes does not provide the support that people who are neurologically diverse or even physically diverse need. So the world is expecting your child to have a very specific set of skills in order to succeed in this world. And your child may not have those skills, and the world is not particularly accommodating to that. So I just want you to think about this in a new way. So would you expect a person who did not have any legs or had significant difficulty with walking to climb up the stairs in a wheelchair? If they were not able to walk, if they were in a wheelchair, we wouldn't expect them to climb the stairs. We would expect them to find a ramp. So I want you to try to think about your child's behavior in a new way. Instead of thinking about your child's behavior as a behavior challenge or something that they're doing to be oppositional or difficult, think of behavior as something that your child is struggling with. So something they need help overcoming, something they need support in terms of skill building. So this emotional regulation, this tantrum, it's not something they're doing to be difficult. They have I guess the best way to describe it is that they have the equivalent of a muscle in their brain that is weak. And that doesn't mean that they can't engage in emotional regulation. It just means just if they're learning how to jump or they're learning speech or they're learning fine motor skills, they have to practice because they have that weak muscle. It's the same exact thing with emotional regulation. They have to practice to get better at it, but they absolutely can do it. So when we think about reducing tantrums, we have to provide multiple different levels of assistance. So we have to help your child find the equivalent of that mental ramp to help support them through their tantrum behavior. So this includes prevention. This includes accommodations. So maybe that's academic accommodations in school. Maybe that's providing additional breaks. Maybe that's accommodations at work to make sure that your child does not get overtired, and other types of support like that. It includes teaching new skills. So making sure your child has that skill set they need to self-advocate, they need to be able to regulate, and then controlling the environment. So making sure we're looking at those behavioral variables that can be maintaining the tantrum and that we're addressing those in the best way that we can. So I just want to take a step back for a very brief moment and just talk about what applied behavior analysis is, in case this isn't something that you're familiar with. So applied behavior analysis is the science of learning and behavior, and it assumes that all behavior is lawful and predictable. So if I can understand why you're behaving in the way that you're behaving, then I can find a way to support you through that, and I can find a way to teach you different adaptive skills. So ABA helps us to understand how behavior works. So why is this behavior occurring? It also helps us to understand how behaviors are affected by the environment. So what is existing within the environment that's potentially triggering these tantrums or triggering this behavior? And what is happening in the environment that's potentially maintaining this behavior? And then we also, within behavior analysis, we look at how learning takes place. So part of behavior analysis is the science of teaching and how a person learns. And so we're very interested in making sure that we can optimize our teaching strategies and that we have teaching strategies for anybody who needs to learn something. So we're not just teaching to the neurotypical population, we're teaching to anybody who needs to learn anything. We can adapt our strategies to make sure that we're supporting you in the way that you need to be supported in order to learn. And so within behavior analysis, you'll hear me talk a lot about antecedents and consequences. And so before I move into this, I just want to clarify what I mean by that. So an antecedent is anything that comes before a behavior. So it could be a trigger, could be whatever predisposed the tantrum. And then a consequence is just whatever comes after the behavior. So like I said, within behavior analysis, we're interested in learning how behavior is affected by the environment. So if I'm trying to learn that, I need to know what comes before the behavior and I need to know what comes after the behavior. But when I'm referring to a consequence, that doesn't mean something negative. So I think that's a difference between the way we say things in behavior analysis versus the way we say things in everyday life. So within behavior analysis, a consequence is just anything that happens after the behavior. It can be a good consequence and it could be a bad consequence. So it could be getting grounded, or it could be getting a bonus. It could be getting a reward. So consequences just means what comes after. And so within behavior analysis, by looking at the antecedents and the consequences, we can figure out what's maintaining the behavior. So we can figure out what's triggering it, and we can figure out what that consequence is that might be making the behavior more or less likely to occur in the future. So typically speaking, if you engage in a behavior and something good happens, you're going to do the behavior again. If you engage in the behavior and something bad happens, you're probably not going to do the behavior again. So if you step on an anthill and you get a whole bunch of bug bites, probably you're going to avoid anthills in the future. But if you perform really well at work and you get a surprise bonus, probably you're going to try to engage in that type of behavior again. So as we're talking specifically about behavior analytic strategies for tantrums, the first thing that we always do as a requirement within behavior analysis is to do what we call a medical rule out. And I think this is particularly important when it comes to anybody with a developmental disability who has communication deficits, because if you can't communicate that you're uncomfortable, you're sick, you're feeling pain, but also especially for Prader-Willi syndrome. So we know that for some people with Prader-Willi syndrome don't experience pain the same way. So that might mean that they feel less pain, they feel pain differently. I don't think that we're exactly clear on how pain is perceived to them. But because of this, it's extremely important to make sure that if your child starts to engage in tantrum behavior, especially if it's uncharacteristic tantrum behavior, so you feel like, typically speaking, you don't have too much tantrum behavior, but then all of a sudden tantrum behavior is off the charts, I would always make sure that there's no pain or illness first before assuming that the behavior is, before treating it in a behavioral way. Because if there's pain, or if the person is not feeling well, then you want to respond with a medical intervention and a supportive intervention, and not assume that this behavior is maintained by other environmental variables. So just to give you a couple of examples of why this is so important. So sometimes I have noticed that pain and other types of discomfort show up as tantrums. So I worked with a child who had this just very, very fast escalation of tantrum behavior and just uncharacteristic tantrum behavior. And thankfully, her mom had the foresight to take her to the dentist, and it turned out that she had a tooth abscess. And the tooth abscess was causing her significant pain. She wasn't reporting that pain to anyone, but she was showing a huge escalation in her behavior. To give you another example, I worked with an adult who, same type of situation, was having a huge escalation in challenging behavior. And so we took her to the doctor just to be safe. And it turned out that she had a UTI. And she had a UTI to the extent where she actually had a fever, which can oftentimes not happen in people with PWS. It was a very, very severe UTI. And she wasn't reporting any symptoms to us. It was just showing up as behavior. So it's really important to take into consideration, if your child is sick, if they're uncomfortable in some way, that might actually be the cause of the tantrums, and just to make sure you rule that out before you jump to any conclusions. A good way, if you're trying to rule this out and you're having a difficulty figuring out whether it's medical or it's not, a lot of times if this escalation in behavior is occurring only in one specific situation, then that's usually a good indication that it's behavioral, versus if the behavior was related to pain, probably you're going to see the escalation of behavior across a couple of different settings. So step 2 is to look at communication. So this takes 2 different forms: functional communication training, or what we call FCT, and then self-advocacy. So when you're ensuring that a person with PWS has the capability to communicate, you have to both look at, are they capable of communicating? So do they have the language skills to communicate? And then also, do they know when to self-advocate, and is their self-advocacy being respected? Because sometimes it's not an issue of language. Sometimes we have kids who are very, very good communicators, and they're put in situations where they are trying very, very hard to self-advocate for themselves, and they either don't know what to say, they don't know when they need to self-advocate, or their self-advocacy is not being respected and therefore not being reinforced. So when it comes to functional communication training, all that functional communication training means is that we're making sure that anybody who has any type of language delay or speech apraxia, anything else that prevents them from communicating, we are making sure that they have a way to communicate their wants and needs. Whether this can be for a child who's fully nonverbal and needs some type of picture communication device, or this can even be for a child who just has a bit of speech delay or has poor enunciation and is difficult to understand. And so sometimes when they're in the school setting, or they're in a setting with people who don't typically spend a lot of time with them, they're hard to understand. So regardless, we want to make sure that in any situation, your child can communicate their basic wants and needs. And that can be a verbal communication system, it can be a picture communication system, it can be an iPad, it can be text to talk, it can be whatever works best for your child. And sometimes you have to try a couple of different ways. But just imagine that, like, in 10 seconds, you lose your ability to talk, and you have to spend the next 2 weeks without being able to communicate your wants and needs. And for some kids, this also means that they're not old enough, they don't know how to write, they don't know how to use sign language or any other type of communication. So just imagine you're in that type of situation, and just think about the number of tantrums that you're going to have when you're trying to tell someone you're hungry, you're tired, your arm itches, you're uncomfortable, you don't like this shirt, and you're not able to do that. Imagine how frustrating that will be. And so before we jump to the assumption that a child is being difficult, we have to first evaluate whether or not they're just trying to communicate the fact that they've been trying to tell us for the last 45 minutes that this test is too hard for them, and we haven't been able to understand, or we haven't been listening. So making sure that kids can communicate, and then making sure, especially with older kids who have very good verbal communication, that they're self-advocating. So this happens a lot, especially in the school setting, where I touched on this briefly, but like with kids with PWS who have fine and gross motor deficits and also daytime sleepiness, getting through a school day is exhausting. If you're required to write, you're required to go to PE, you're required to go to recess, you have to walk up and down the stairs to get to the lunchroom, and then you're just generally tired all the time. Just getting through the day is extra exhausting. And so a lot of times, especially in the school setting that requires a lot of moving around and a lot of concentration, of auditory processing skills, of fine motor capabilities, following directions, transitions, everything that we know is very, very difficult for people with PWS, they need a lot of breaks and they need a lot of help. And they need a lot more breaks than the other kids in the classroom. And a lot of times, especially for kids in younger classrooms, the type of breaks that they give are movement breaks. And sometimes people with PWS just need to be able to put their pen down and sit quietly for a moment. So we want to make sure that kids are able to notice when they start heading to the point where they're getting overexhausted, because a lot of times it goes, difficult task, I'm trying very hard to do what you want me to do, I'm getting exhausted, nobody's noticing that, and then all of a sudden I'm having a tantrum. And so we want to make sure that kids themselves are able to self-identify when they're struggling, when they're heading in that direction, and they're able to successfully self-advocate for a break. And we also want to make sure that the people who are supporting them, the physical therapist, the occupational therapist, the teacher, the paraprofessional, the one-on-one, are able to catch those signals early, prompt self-advocacy. And even if they miss it and they're not able to prompt the self-advocacy to if our children are able to self-advocate, then please reinforce it. If they're telling you they need a break in an appropriate way and they're not having a tantrum, that needs to be reinforced. So making sure that those supports are in place. So as I'm sure all of you know, tantrums a lot of times are predisposed by transitions and changes in schedule. And so there is a very small amount of research that indicates that for people with PWS, it's transitioning from any activity to any activity. So a lot of times, I mean, with any kid, with any adult, honestly, transitioning from a task that we do like to do to something we don't really want to do is not that reinforcing, and all of us might throw a little bit of a tantrum. So if we have to go from taking a nap on the couch to doing cardio, nobody wants to do that. We're probably going to complain along the way. So that's pretty typical of everybody. But for kids with PWS, it can even be transitioning from something that they really don't want to do to something that they actually really want to do. So for example, finishing up your math worksheet that's really hard for you and going to lunch. And kids with PWS are having a struggle with that transition. So it's not that they're being difficult or they're being defiant. It's that their brain struggles with the process of transitioning from one task to another. And it's not that they're saying no, they're just saying, I need a bit more time. You're rushing my brain too much. My brain can't do it. And if you continue to rush my brain, I'm going to get emotionally dysregulated, and that's not fun for anybody. So just give me a little bit of time to handle this transition. And so what this can look like, this can be, especially in the classroom setting, putting in these types of supports can be really, really beneficial in terms of preventing tantrums. And the best intervention for tantrums is prevention. So prevention and teaching the alternative skills, but the more you can prevent, the more you can support, the better, because then there's fewer challenges that the person has to struggle with. So providing a predictable visual or written schedule. So it's very good to let people with PWS know what is expected, let it be predictable, and if there's a change, something that they can clearly visualize the change, so it's not difficult to understand. Build in time for transitions and give warnings. So this can be during your morning routine to prevent tantrums. This can be at the classroom. And what that can look like is like, all right, we got 5 minutes to change out of our pajamas and to put on our school clothes. And then we're going to go to brush our teeth. So if you need a couple of minutes between getting out of bed and starting getting dressed, maybe I'm going to give you a 2-minute timer for that. Or in the classroom, if we're going to say, okay, it's time to wrap up our math worksheet and we're going to go out to recess, I'm going to give you a 2-minute timer, 2 additional minutes to go ahead and process that change. Or it can be a countdown. It can be finish a number of questions. For example, if you have a child who likes to get all of their baby dolls dressed and ready for the day in the morning, and that's okay, but the problem is that there's 26 baby dolls, and so now we're all late to school. You could say, okay, we can do 3 more baby dolls, and then we have to go ahead and get in the car to go to school. So building in some time for that transition, but also giving warnings and setting limits around that and making sure that you're consistent. And reinforcing flexibility and timely transitions. So this comes down to just catching your kids being good. So if your child is super duper fast one morning, maybe you let them pick a whole playlist of songs that they want to play on the way to school. Or maybe they have a little bit of time to watch their favorite TV show because they were so fast that morning. If you notice that it was a situation like a change in schedule that would typically predispose a tantrum, and your child just happens to be really flexible, find a way to reinforce that. Make a really big deal of it, because the things that we reinforce, we tend to increase. And so if your child is working on those flexibility skills, that's something that we want to make sure we recognize and we reinforce. So step 4 is, and potentially one of the more important steps, is to increase motivations. So if motivation singular. So if refusals or not wanting to do tasks are prompting tantrums, make sure your child is motivated. So this, again, can be at home. This can be that your child really doesn't want to get ready for bed. They don't want to clean up their toys. They don't want to brush their teeth. They don't want to take a shower. Because again, those behaviors are physically difficult. We don't think about them as being physically difficult, but for kids with PWS, they are physically difficult. And so what I hear a lot from parents is that in the evening or in the morning, their child is really good about just slowing down the whole entire situation. So they're just dragging their feet. And then the more pressure parents put on them, the more that leads to tantrum behavior. So this is another one of those, like, make sure your child has the motivation. And this is especially true in the classroom setting. If your child doesn't have the motivation to engage in the task and you push it, you're going to have a tantrum. So make sure that motivation is there, and then shape the behavior. So we're going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about self-calming strategies, and we're going to talk about shaping there too. But shaping just means that you are using what's the best way to explain this? You're taking where your child is now and you're building a bridge to where you want them to be. So that might be just looking at how we can get them to take tiny, 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 tiny little steps from where they are now to where we need them to be. So that might look like we're just trying to get 30 seconds faster in the morning, and then we're trying to get a minute faster, and then 5 minutes. But looking at how you can change behavior in incremental ways, that's not a big stressful change that's potentially going to cause tantrums, but that is eventually getting you where you want to go. And then one of the questions, I'm just going to talk about this really fast before I move on to the self-calming strategies, but one of the questions I always get asked when I recommend any type of reinforcement system is, what about intrinsic motivation? So I want my child to be intrinsically motivated to behave the right way. I want them to want to learn to calm down, to want to do their self-care tasks by themselves. So something that we have to keep in mind is that the world runs on reinforcement. Whether or not we like it, that's the way it is. So the world economy is a token system. So if we're implementing a token economy with kids with PWS, we are teaching them the skills that they need to move through the world. So we're teaching them how to manage money. We're teaching them how to save, which is delaying reinforcement, which is very hard for lots of people, but also people with PWS. So if you're going to use a reinforcement system, do it in a smart way. So first, of course, work on the behaviors that you want to work on, but also make sure you're teaching additional practical skills like delaying reinforcement and money management skills. And then be smart with your system in a way that builds in what we would call, quote unquote, intrinsic motivation. So our goal with a reinforcement system is to create lasting habits of behavior. So that might be a lasting habit of using your self-calming strategies, or that might be a lasting habit of doing your schoolwork in a timely fashion so that you don't end up in a disagreement with your paraprofessional that de-escalates into tantrum behavior all day. So the way that we can build the motivation to engage in these types of skills without the actual presence of a reinforcement system is first to vary reinforcement. So what we know about variable reinforcement is if reinforcement is somewhat unexpected, then people try harder to try to get that reinforcement. Versus if you, for example, say you get paid every Friday, one day your job stops paying you. Probably you're going to stop going to work. So that's a consistent reinforcement schedule. If that goes out the window, you're not going to bother with the behavior anymore. But then you can think about things like gambling. So with gambling behavior, you see people sitting there and playing the slot machine again and again and again and again, and they never know when they're going to win, but they keep doing it. And that's the power of variable reinforcement. So if you're going to use a system of reinforcement, you want to use variable reinforcement, because what you want to do is change from the pattern of behavior that you have now. So the pattern of behavior that you might be experiencing right now is that your child is engaging in tantrum behaviors, and they're doing a very creatively good job of getting out of things that they don't want to do by using that tantrum behavior, or getting access to things that they want with that tantrum behavior. So they're looking for reinforcement in the incorrect way. They're engaging in the tantrum behavior, and they're using that to try to get what they want. No good. But if we have a system of reinforcement, we can flip the script. So if we're using variable reinforcement and we're not letting those tantrums get reinforced, you can teach your child to look for reinforcement with good behavior. So then you're seeing them go above and beyond to potentially see if reinforcement is available, but you're creating that habit of doing the right thing to try to get reinforcement from the world instead of doing the incorrect thing or engaging in a behavior that we wouldn't exactly want you to try to get reinforcement for the world. So you can create good habits. Your goal is to create the habit of them trying to behave well, and then you can fade your system and let the world maintain that. So let the world continue to reinforce that. And then remember that when it comes to dealing with tantrum behaviors, we have to make sure your child has a ramp. And so for people with PWS who we know are trying so hard just to get regular daily stuff done. So we know that these school tasks, these daily tasks of living, exercise, all of that is like 3 times harder for them. We want to make sure that we are providing the support they need. And this part of the support they need, especially in like a school setting to prevent tantrums, might be making sure they have a reinforcement system or making sure they have a motivation to want to do those school tasks so that they don't feel like they have to tantrum. Just some quick thoughts on why your reinforcement system might not be working. If you have one, you have to make sure your reinforcers are strong enough. So what you think is a reinforcer may not be a reinforcer for your child. You're requiring too much work to earn the reinforcer. So we all only do as much work as we get paid for. So make sure that we are compensating kids for the effort that they're putting in, especially in the classroom setting. Your child doesn't understand what the expectations are, or the system is delivered inconsistently. So if I tell you you can earn tokens for working on calming yourself down or for not having tantrums, and I give them to you one day, but I don't give them to you the next day and I don't explain why, that can be problematic. Opportunities to earn tokens are too few and far between. So your child doesn't understand what the system is for in the first place. And then tokens get taken away arbitrarily. And you see my frowny face there. So if we're going to put consequences, and I mean consequences in the way we use it typically in language. So if we're going to put bad consequences in place, we need to make sure that that is directly related to behavior and not something arbitrary. So if I don't understand, I have a tantrum, you take my tokens away, I don't really know what's going on, that's going to make me lose faith in the system. It would be like if you were at work and somebody randomly walked up to you and said, oh, you did something bad, so I'm fining you $500 on your paycheck. Probably you're going to quit that job. So we want to make sure that we're not engaging in any type of arbitrary removing of tokens or any reinforcers for that matter, because it can make kids lose faith in the system. And then step 5, and I think this comes back to talking about making sure that kids have that like ramp, that mental ramp. I don't know how to best explain what I'm trying to say here, but pick your battles. So ask yourself, is this a hard limit or can I be flexible? So is this something that I really need to set a limit on, or can I negotiate? Can I have a little flexibility here? And to tie directly into that, is this important for health and well-being? So if this is something that's small and arbitrary, maybe I can be flexible about it. But if it's something that's important for your health and well-being, then I'm not going to be flexible about it. And then we have to work on the emotional regulation strategies that might come along with that tantrum. And then, is this a help them find a ramp situation? So can I acknowledge that because you have PWS, you are a little bit more rigid than everybody else is? And can I find a way to support that instead of picking a fight with you over it? And then avoid escalating the tantrum by reacting. So I think any of us can get reactive in a situation where a kid's having a tantrum, whether they have PWS or not. But when they do have PWS, it can be extra difficult because PWS tantrums can be so long and they can be so hard to de-escalate. So make sure you're not modeling that inappropriate behavior. So if you're arguing, if you're yelling, if you're having a tantrum yourself, then that is indicative to your child that that's an okay way to address the situation. So just trying to make sure that you're modeling the behavior that you want your child to engage in. Try to resolve the situation without saying anything. So sometimes the way that we escalate tantrum behaviors is that we come into the situation and we try to have a big discussion about it. And sometimes the shame that's associated with that situation. So I made a mistake, I broke something, I did something I wasn't supposed to. And so then, like, if I, as Kasey, the behavior analyst, come in and have a whole discussion with you about it, then you're likely to escalate to tantrum behavior to escape my social disapproval, versus if I just resolved the situation and didn't say too much about it, then I might be able to prevent the escalation. And then avoid getting sucked into arguments that are going to escalate behaviors. So if you know that your child has a typical pattern where a trigger happens, they argue, they escalate, they have a tantrum, just don't get sucked into that argument. I have been working with people with PWS for over 8 years, and I have never won an argument. You're not going to win. It's not worth it. Don't get sucked into the argument. Minimize your attention to it and try to redirect or try to work on self-calming. And then set a limit without any negative interactions. So there's this video out there somewhere on the internet of a police officer arresting someone, but he's doing it in like the funniest, nicest, kindest, most joking way. So there is a way to give people a speeding ticket, and there's a way to set limits without making it aversive. So trying to be as kind and as supportive while setting the limit, and trying to avoid any negative interactions that are associated with that, because that escalates anybody. And then possibly the most important, or if you ask me, the most important, teach your child explicitly how to calm down. So what this looks like, so just to give you a picture of what a tantrum looks like for anybody, there's kids are calm, something triggers them, they get agitated, they escalate to the peak of the tantrum, and then eventually they de-escalate. So nobody can stay mad forever. Everybody eventually calms down. In comparison to what this looks like for typical kids, kids with PWS tend to escalate a bit more quickly. So they go from 0 to 100 very quickly, and then they can take their time calming themselves down and de-escalating. And so we have 2 different times that we can intervene. We can intervene when kids first get agitated, or we can intervene when they're accelerating towards that tantrum. But there is no teaching anybody anything when they're in the peak of the tantrum. That's not the time to intervene. So when kids get agitated, so right after that first trigger, this is when we work on our prevention. So this is when we prompt functional communication, or we prompt some type of preventative calming strategy. So counting forward and backward, breathing, tracing your hand, pushing a wall, stress ball, kids meditation, anything that you want to come up with. And when I send out these slides, I will include the list of resources that I usually suggest. But as I'm sure will come as no surprise to any of you, because kids go from 0 to 100, there's not a lot of time for prevention. So, but you always try, because if we can prevent the tantrum, an ounce of prevention is better than, I don't know what the saying goes, but if we can prevent a tantrum, that's better for everybody. Nobody's emotionally exhausted. Everybody's much happier. So always try. But if you fail, that's completely to be expected, and that is totally okay. So once we are in the acceleration phase, this is where we start to work on the de-escalation. And so we know that we're not going to magically teach anyone when they're in the peak of the tantrum. So we start setting that structure and limit as a person accelerates, and then they start to work on it on their own as they de-escalate. So this is where we're going to start working on practicing emotional regulation in a safe space, which is also what I call a calming break, but you can call it whatever works for you. So why a calming break? What is the point of this? A calming break presents an opportunity to develop self-regulation skills. It also makes kids calm or proud of calming themselves down. So what typically happens is kids have a tantrum, eventually they calm themselves down, but everybody's so frustrated, understandably so, that we forget that kids with PWS, they have that weak emotional regulation muscle. And so we have to do some explicit teaching when it comes to calming down. And we also have to reinforce it, which is so important. But we forget to do that because we're all so frustrated, understandably so. But if we can focus on calming down as a self-calming break versus something that just gets tacked on to the end of the tantrum, it gives us the opportunity to praise kids for working on that. And it gives them the opportunity to be proud of it and to take ownership of it instead of just feeling embarrassed and shameful about the tantrum. It also reduces the likelihood of another person escalating the tantrum. So if you're having your child step away and take a break from the situation, nobody else is around. So that means nobody's intervening, nobody's redirecting, nobody's promising candy in the waiting room of the doctor's office if your child just calms down. So it reduces the likelihood of somebody else getting involved and potentially escalating or reinforcing the tantrum. And it also gives you the opportunity to avoid reinforcing the tantrum. So we don't want to reinforce that tantrum, but to find something to praise. So find something to start putting that relationship back together, working on that skill building so that everybody can come out the other side of the tantrum with more skills and feeling happier. So what does this look like? In preparation, I want you to choose a quiet, neutral location in your house and not anywhere that your child has been sent when they're in trouble. So I don't want this to have any association with them being in trouble. I want this to be a completely new space. So somewhere that they can go to, they can feel safe, they can feel work on calming themselves down and feel safe without having any negative connotation around it. This can be the corner of a bedroom with a beanbag chair. So make sure it's a safe space, of course, but also make sure it's a comfy space. So you can put a special chair there, you can put blankets on the floor, you can put a beanbag chair, you can put some calming activities for your child to work on. So you can put coloring there, nothing that's highly preferred. We don't want to put the iPad in this corner. That's not what we want to do, but some stuff that's mildly preferred, that's calming, that your child can choose to work on as they're working on de-escalating themselves. And then I want you to rehearse the process 9 million times with your child when they're calm. So like I said, it's extremely difficult for anyone to learn anything when they're upset. And so when kids are mid-tantrum, we can't be like, oh, hey, let me teach you how to like work on this self-calming break. Because once your brain stops working, when you're in that tantrum fight or flight mode, the centers of your brain that are responsible for learning are completely shut down. So there's no learning going on there. And the other thing that is it's difficult for anyone to use adaptive skills or use self-calming skills when they're upset. So it has to be something that is really, really well rehearsed so that you can use that strategy when you're in that dysregulated state. So to be able to access those strategies when you're in that emotionally escalated state, you have to be really good at them. And part of that is rehearse. And you can do this in a fun way. So this can be like you get your child to prompt you to take the self-calming break and you model it for them and then you switch. And it's not like they have to go through sitting in their room for 5 minutes to practice the self-calming break. It can be a quick 30-second thing. What I want them to practice is when somebody prompts them to take a self-calming break, they step away from the situation, they practice self-calming for 30 seconds, doing whatever their chosen activity is, and they come back. The difficult part is the stepping away part. That is the most difficult part for people with PWS. So we need them to rehearse. When I say self-calming break, you go to your calming spot again and again and again. And then when the tantrum occurs, of course, try your prevention strategies first. And if this fails, then we move on to the calming break. So then we move on to saying something like, I'm not able to help you when you're upset. So your child's having a tantrum, they start to escalate. You might say, hey, I really can't help you when you're yelling. So I'm going to help you to take a calming break. And you can validate their emotions along the way. So you can say, I can hear how upset you are that we can't go to the park right now, but I can't help you with anything while you're yelling. So I would like you to take a self-calming break. And then you get them to move to that calm down spot. And then you let them know that you're going to give them a couple of minutes to calm down. In this time period, they can choose whatever they want. They can color, they can do deep breathing, they can do a kid's meditation, they can fling themselves on their bed and lay there. I don't care. They can choose whatever strategy they want, but they have to stay there until they start to de-escalate. And once they start to de-escalate, then you're going to set a 2 or a 5 minute timer. You might start, if you know they're quick to calm down, you might start it as soon as they go to the calming space. If they're not so quick to calm down, you might wait until you hear them stop crying, and then you set a timer. But we need to make sure that they're really, truly calm before we're starting that timer, because the goal is that they've shown that they can fully de-escalate. And then we're going to stay calm for a little bit past when you stop crying, or a little bit past when you showed that you were calm, because we know that people with PWS are very good at perseverating. And if we come and we intervene too quickly, they might just re-escalate all over again. However, when they do stay calm for that 2 to 5 minutes, then you want to go crazy. Like, you want to deliver your tokens, you want to deliver if there's a bonus in place, you want to praise, you want to call their grandparents and tell them how well they did, because you don't necessarily have to identify for them what their calming strategies are. All you have to do is capitalize on the fact that they're figuring it out themselves and praise it. Because the more that we praise self-calming, the more we praise anything or we reinforce anything, the more likely kids are to go, okay, wait a second. What did I do? Let me go think about what I did and let me try to do that again. So maybe you can't get your child into deep breathing, you can't get them into anything like that, but all you have to do is let them figure it out themselves and then reinforce for that. And this, I could probably talk to you guys about this for like 3.5 hours. So if you're confused about how to do this, I'm not surprised, because this is like a crash course in 10 minutes of how to build a self-calming break. I have lots of resources in place that I can give you, but this gives you an overview of the basic steps. And also remember that it's not a straight line. So you have to meet your child wherever they're at, and then you have to look at what tiny little steps you can take to get them to where you want them to be. So maybe what that looks like is they have a 45-minute tantrum in the middle of the living room. They refuse the self-calming break. But after 45 minutes, they sit by themselves, they find something to do in the living room, and they calm down. Fine, that's a self-calming break. We'll take it, we'll reinforce that. And then I'm just going to try to get you closer and closer to your room. I'm just going to try to get you to go sooner and sooner to do the self-calming break. So there's lots of ways that we can modify this system to meet your child where you're at. We don't have to fit them into this exact protocol. We can modify the protocol to make sure that we meet them where they're at and get them to where they need to be. And then after the tantrum, we want to avoid rehashing or discussing the tantrum itself. So when you activate the shame part of the brain, so feeling shame or feeling guilty, the learning center shuts down. So if we're trying to discuss the tantrum in such a way that's making kids feel guilty, we're not going to be able to teach them anything. So rather, focus all your attention on how proud you are for them calming down and the way that they calm themselves down, and then leave it alone. And a little later, when there's a little bit less stress around the situation, that's a good time to rehearse possible alternatives in the future. So depending on how resistant your child is, maybe you can bring that up in the exact setting of the tantrum, or maybe you need to bring it up in a hypothetical situation to try to practice what we could have done differently. But I am by no means saying that a tantrum is not a teaching moment, because sometimes there are. You do need to discuss with your child what they could have done differently and how things could have been handled. But sometimes it's better to do that a bit later, especially if you're focusing on calming down as a skill. So if calming down is a skill, I want to pay all my attention to the fact that you calmed yourself down when you succeed in that. And then I'll worry about the teaching moment a little bit later. All right, so we have about 10 more minutes. So I will go ahead and open it up for questions now. And actually, while we do this, I'm going to put up my contact information. So if you're still confused, that's okay. Send me an email.
Awesome. Thank you, Kasey. That was great. And like you said, there's a lot of information, and you could talk for hours and we could listen for hours. So there's a few questions. Let's just run through those. The first one from Lisa. Do you actually have a list of networks, telehealth professionals that have experience with PWS, if one exists? Should love to get more of that information.
I do know of like 3 or 4 professionals. I do not know if they provide telehealth services. So reach out to me and I can try to connect you with somebody who would be able to support your child. Something that I do very often is connect people with local professionals who are unfamiliar with PWS. And then I work to train your local behavior people on PWS. So we can do that as well.
Great, thank you. Question from Barb. Many programs resist tokens, points, stickers for rewarding appropriate behavior because they feel they are institutional. Any suggestions or resources to share that can counter that mindset?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that I come into contact with a lot. And I understand on the one hand, because you don't want to be putting a system in place that feels disrespectful to the people. So I'm not going to go and work with a group of adults with PWS and say like, oh, you're going to earn stickers for that. Would be rude. Like that would be straight up rude. So I think a lot, like the way that I approach those types of situations is finding out what the concerns of that specific organization is, and finding out if there's a way that we can provide reinforcement in a way that feels genuine to them, but is also still respectful of the fact that people with PWS might need that extra motivation. I don't have any direct resources, but if you reach out to me with your specific scenario, then I'm happy to help pull some together.
Perfect. Next question is actually two questions. One, how can we figure out what is an age-appropriate tantrum versus PWS related? And then second, is there a way to get ABA therapy without an autism diagnosis?
Yep, those are great questions. So the way that I look at it is that I don't care if it's age appropriate or not. I think teaching emotional regulation is always a good skill. So I wouldn't even worry about whether or not it's age appropriate. I would just be like, hey, regardless of whether this is because you're young or because you have PWS, this is a great opportunity for me to help you learn something that's going to improve your quality of life. So that's the way that I would approach that. I would work on the prevention side. I would just be like, we're going to work on this. No big deal. Can't hurt, can definitely help. And then the question about accessing ABA services if you don't have an autism diagnosis, that tends to be very difficult. There are a couple of states where people have succeeded in getting ABA therapy without an autism diagnosis, but it is very few and far between. And even if you try to get some people even who try to get reimbursed for ABA therapy who do have an autism diagnosis sometimes have a hard time with that if they're trying to seek support from PWS professionals to support their behavior person. If you have a child who has a PWS diagnosis and not an autism diagnosis, I do have a free parent training program that is focused in ABA that you can come and you can do. It's not one-on-one therapy, but you will at least learn the basic strategies that you need to be able to support your child. And then you can use that to support your school and to support all of the other people who are helping to support your child. It's not, I wish I could give everybody like one-on-one in-person ABA therapy with a magic wand, but for now, the parent training program is the best that I have. So if you send me an email, I'm happy to get you set up with that as well.
That's awesome. Thank you, Kasey. Next question. What if your kid is intent on having the tantrum and won't cooperate with the calming break?
Yep, that's totally typical. If imagine you walk into any situation and you tell someone, this is the way that you're gonna calm down. They're gonna say, no. So that's totally normal. So that's what I was talking about, where you just need to find where your child is and you need to figure out what you can reinforce in that moment. And so maybe they're in the living room, they're having a tantrum, they're flatly refusing the self-calming break. I would say, you know what, forget it. We're not even gonna prompt it. Eventually, they will wear themselves out. That's calming down. I'm going to reinforce that. And then as soon as I start to reinforce that, it changes the script a little bit. So instead of us being at odds with each other, all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait a minute. I'm not quite sure what happened there, but I got reinforced for that. So now maybe I'm going to start looking for other avenues where I can earn that. And then I'm just going to make tiny little changes. So then maybe I'm letting you have your tantrum for 45 minutes in the living room. You calm yourself down. I praise you. And then 30 minutes later, I practice you to go try a self-calming break when you're totally calm and you're not in the mood to fight with me. And I reinforce that. And then I just try to make them closer and closer together. So instead of being 45 minutes apart, I want them to be 30 and then 22. And then I want them to, maybe you have your full tantrum in the living room, but then at the end, you go do your self-calming break. And so we just try to condense the whole process. So if you send me an email with your specific scenario of what's going on, I can help you break down those steps of how to get from where you are to where you want to be.
Okay, and Lisa is just sharing, she's been doing these calming breaks with her daughter. So for practice between 30 seconds and a minute, and stating, go take your calming break and do X. That way she chooses something to do, taking her mind off the behavior. And then when she comes out, they give her praise and it's been working. So that's great to hear, Lisa. Yay.
And I love what you said, Lisa, about letting her choose. So
Mhm.
sometimes where we run into difficulty with the self-calming break is if we say, you're going to go to your bedroom and you're going to take deep breaths. And the kids, no, I'm not. So definitely letting your child have agency and have choice over what they want to do to calm themselves down, and supporting them in finding their way through that is definitely important.
And I think this next one, in public, when there's an outburst, there's no stop, think, use strategies of calming down her child. But I think that's true. When you're in the moment, especially in public, it's hard.
Definitely. And so when you first start trying to work on these self-calming strategies, I recommend only work on them at home, because you want to work on them where you can have success. And then when you start to see your child get good at it, that's when you figure out how to do it in public. But you by no means always prioritize safety over running whatever crazy strategies Kasey told you to do. So safety always comes first, and we worry about the teaching strategies later. So it's okay sometimes to do whatever you have to do to make sure you're safe in that moment, and then worry about, okay, what could I have done differently, and how can I plan for the future, so that if I have a tantrum, I can make sure there's a safe space to do a calming break, or my child is set up in advance, knowing what the expectations and the reinforcers are for good behavior in this situation. But it is definitely more difficult in public, because it's more stress inducing for you and your child. And also because there's more people to get in the way, and there's more people to get attention. But you can, especially when your child starts to get really good at it, it becomes easier to move that into public.
Just a really quick question, Kasey, what state are you located in? Barb wants to know.
I am in Florida, but I am telehealth, so I am wherever you want me to be.
All right, thank you. There was a question on how to specifically engage your child in the self-calming practice.
So you would have to have, what your child likes. So I would pick out something that is going to be highly motivated to choose in advance as a reinforcer, to get them to actually want to go ahead and try to do it. And then try to make it fun or funny. So you can explain to them what the expectations are, but then you can let them tell you to go do it. The more you can make it a game and less of like, I am going to kind of order you into this room and make you calm. Like, the more you can make it fun, the more you can get them engaged. But definitely finding a motivator in advance that they know they're working for will help you to get buy-in.
Okay. And then this one from Nancy, rehashing an incident when calm, PWS client will say, why are you bringing this up? It's over. And then this begins to get them agitated again. So just any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I would address that in a hypothetical situation like the next week. So I would say, for example, if it was a big tantrum happened in a public location, and I'm like, ooh, that was super unsafe. We got to talk about that, because I want to make sure that that doesn't happen again. So I would say, like, okay, well, what if we run into this struggle again in the future? What could we do to resolve this? Not talking about the specific instance, but saying like, hey, what if somebody on the street bumps into you and you're really annoyed by that? How could we resolve that? And talking generally speaking versus talking about the specific situation. Because if they're feeling offended by you bringing up the specific situation, you're not going to resolve anything.
Okay. And do you have any recommendations for, again, these tantrums that happen outside of home in the public, if you don't have access somewhere to go for a calming break? Thoughts on what you could do just in that moment?
So I usually, if you have a car, I usually suggest going to the car to do the calming break, because that's safe. If you can't, but you can step out of whatever the building is, basically choosing a space where you're safe in case there's a behavior that occurs, but has as few people as possible. So walking out of the movie theater and going into the family bathroom to do it there, or walking out and walking down farther away from where other people might be. The less audience, the better, the more likely you are to get control over the situation. But sometimes there are situations, if you're not able to get to do the self-calming break in public and it's getting unsafe, that you might have to set some limits and say like, hey, these are my expectations, but if you're not able to follow that, we're unsafe, we're going to have to skip the next time. And that's totally okay. Like, it's okay to put safety procedures in place while you're working on teaching those self-calming breaks until you're confident in them. That's okay too.
Great. Next question is, being rewarded for expected behavior can become so routine in schools that students begin to expect to be rewarded. Token reward programs are difficult to implement in the classroom with 25 to 30 kids. Any ideas for a more realistic reward system for teachers to implement?
Yeah, that's a great point. And so I think that comes down to being clever about your system. So I never want to tell you to put a system in place that you can't actually implement. Like, I'm not going to come out here and say, yeah, you should provide a reinforcer for every 30 seconds that the child sits in the chair. It's not doable. So making sure that you are focusing on one or two things at a time, the things that are really important. Maybe that's getting control of a behavior challenge before you even address a learning task, but focusing on the things that are really important to make sure that everyone is first safe and then second learning, and then using that variable reinforcement. So maybe it's not doable for you to deliver a token on a 5-minute schedule, a 10-minute schedule. You just can't do that if you're teaching 30 kids. It's not doable. So then maybe you use a surprise reinforcement system where you're delivering the reinforcers contingent on when you catch the child being good. And because what we know about variable reinforcement, that may be even more powerful than the typical type of reinforcement systems that are recommended in schools.
Yeah, that's a great question. It is tough in school when you have that many kids and trying to, but that's a good idea. Do you have any materials for young adults, age 26 with PWS, infrequent tantrums but getting worse?
Materials in terms of how to teach them emotional regulation skills, I'm guessing. I guess you can ask.
Maybe.
So, okay. Yes, I do. I have kind of like a step-by-step protocol that I walk everyone through, and it gives resources regardless of what age you are. So if you send me an email, I'm more than happy to send that to you.
Thanks, Kasey.
We also have
ahead.
the caregiver training class that is for anybody of any age. So it doesn't matter if you have a 2-year-old, it doesn't matter if you have a 46-year-old, everything applies.
Great. I know we are at time, but we have just a couple more questions if you're okay, Kasey?
Yeah.
Okay. How do you train adults, parents, direct service providers to use less words during the escalation cycle? Our experience is that the severity is directly related to the amount of words from adults.
Definitely. That comes back to solve the situation without saying anything. I think that I'm not sure who is asking this question, but if you're asking this question as a parent, I think it will be very difficult for you to train the direct service provider because they probably think that they know better than you. It probably is something that needs to come from higher up. So that needs to be, if it's in a residential program or even if it's like a in-home services, that type of training that's PWS specific, that's talking about how to handle these types of situations, needs to be delivered in a systematic way, and it needs to come from above. So if it were me, I would probably try to find out like who is in charge of that type of training and see if they can't pull something together so that they can train the direct service providers. Then they can monitor whether or not they're going through with the behaviors that are taught and do retraining based on that. But yeah, that's a tough one. Nobody likes to hear that they're not doing things the right way. And the way we respond as humans is to try to say more and fix the situation. And it just doesn't work for people with PWS.
Great. The next two are just sort of suggestions. So Barb said she likes the idea of using a blanket or beanbag chair as part of the calming break. So that's great. Dawn said she found music as a motivator or a token. So she'll play a song on her phone from a movie that her child loves. So I think those are great suggestions.
Yeah, when it comes to motivators, anything that's an activity and not something you're buying is my favorite type of reinforcer. I don't want you to have 756 baby dolls in your house because you have to give them as reinforcers. So silly things that I've had kids ask for as reinforcers is like getting to pick the silly socks that their dad wears to work, or having a picnic on the living room floor instead of eating at the dinner table. Songs are great ideas. Reading extra books at nighttime, any kind of fun stuff like that you can come up with is a beautiful reinforcer because it has the added benefit of, especially if it's something social like family game night, you're practicing social skills, you're building relationships between siblings, and you're also giving a reinforcer, and also it doesn't cost you any money, which is good for everyone.
I know personally at our house, we use the picnic on the living room floor a lot as a reinforcer because he loves that. When PWS children fall asleep during school, is it okay to encourage them not to sleep, or do you think that it would occur more, the tantrums?
So my thought when a kid with PWS is falling asleep in school is probably that they're legitimately tired. There are some kids who are very good at just going, nope, not doing math today, and putting themselves to sleep, in which case it is possibly behavioral. But because of the extent to which we know people with PWS struggle with weird sleep related stuff, sleep apnea, narcolepsy, daytime sleepiness, just general fatigue, I always assume they're tired. So I would look at addressing how to make sure they're not tired, whether I'm providing extra breaks, I'm making sure they're getting enough sleep at night, I am creatively scheduling their afternoon therapies so that they're not exhausted the next day. If it's a younger child, making sure they're getting to nap in school. I would look at it like it's tiredness first and then potentially consider other things after.
Okay, and the next question, I'm a stepmom of an 18-year-old with PWS. My husband has shared custody. What can we do to prevent tantrums that might be related to environmental changes?
So sometimes it's really difficult if you have people doing two different things in different settings. And so presumably you can't, if you can, like if everyone's co-parenting brilliantly together and you can come up with a plan of how to make things as consistent as possible, that's great. But sometimes you can't control it. You can only control what happens at your house, and that's perfectly okay. So I would set up the structure and the expectations as clearly as you can in your setting. Make sure that you're making sure those resources are in and rules are in place for all those transitions. And you might have a hard time with the transition, but once the transition is over, you're probably going to be okay. And you can 100% create different patterns of behavior in different settings. So you can put the supports in place to make sure that when the child's at your house, everything goes brilliantly. And that might mean that at the other parent's house, everything is not going so brilliantly, but that's okay. Because as long as you're providing the support that they need in your house, that's all you're responsible for.
Great advice. Lastly, Charles just wants to thank you for your presentation, Kasey, and for all your assistance you've provided his family, his daughter, and their BCBAs. And I would like to thank you as well, just for being here today and sharing all your knowledge and expertise, and for spending a few extra minutes with us today. So thank you very much. We have one presentation left that starts at 6:30 Eastern time. So hopefully people can join us for that. But Kasey, thank you. And again, these presentations will be on our YouTube channel, on our website. We'll be sending out the link to everybody that registered. So you will be able to review all of this great content.
Thanks everybody for attending. And if you have any questions or you need any resources, don't hesitate to email me. I love to email resources and to help however I can. So don't hesitate to reach out and ask questions if you have them.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody.